Once greeted by the Speaker of the House, Mr Keith Biles, His Excellency the Governor began his speech by reflecting upon the previous year and the global upheaval due to the coronavirus pandemic. There is nowhere in the world that has not been affected by the impact of the pandemic, he said, and the Falkland Islands is no different.
While we have been able to control the number of positive cases, this has been in no small part due to the cooperation of the community in complying with the strict quarantine and self-isolation measures. Although we have not experienced lockdown in the same way as many other countries, the Falkland Islands is a place that embraces freedom in all its forms, and I know that these restrictions have made life difficult. The welfare of our people has been paramount throughout the course of the pandemic, but government has also needed to act decisively to support our local businesses, which have required financial stimulus over the past year, in particular in our tourism and agriculture sectors.
Despite the pandemic and the lack of tourists to the islands, the Governor noted that the Falklands were still able to enjoy a surplus in the budget and have maintained a strong financial position and therefore able to provide COVID-19 stimulus and support packages. In looking at the political context of the previous year, the Governor mentioned the DNA identification work to identify 115 individuals buried in the Argentine cemetery near Darwin, and also the support of the UK government during the pandemic, especially with respect to getting on-island testing capabilities and also the rollout of the vaccination programme. He also mentioned that this coming November the Falklands will hold a general election, and then acknowledged that the efforts of MLA Roger Edwards and MLA Dr Barry Ellsby, who will both be retiring from politics at the next election. The largest contributor to the Falkland Islands gross domestic product is of course the fishing industry, and the Governor spoke about how the government had worked closely with the fishing companies this year to ensure that vessels were able to operate safely.
I am therefore pleased to report that our catch numbers were superb this season. The total ILEC catch was 153,000 tonnes, the best since 2015. The Ligo has also attained a record high for the first season, with more than 59,000 tonnes caught in 2 months, the same quantity as for the whole of 2020. 2020 also saw a catch of 43,376 tonnes of hake, which is the second highest catch of the past decade. Good news all round.
Earlier on in the year, an Executive Council paper was released about the state of the hospital, and it did make worrying reading. In his speech, the Governor noted that the hospital was undergoing significant refurbishments and new equipment was being installed, with a new operating theatre set to follow before the end of next year. Comforting thoughts when the EXCO paper stated that the theatre had not been updated since the late 80s. In the education section of the speech, the Governor praised the early years provision in the Falklands as well as the Falklands College. The schools, IJS and FIX, along with a Stanley House, would be included in the 10-year capital programme for improvement, including an extension for the community school. The Governor concluded with a mention of the students studying.
That said, this has undoubtedly been a difficult year for our young people, and in particular for those undertaking further and higher education overseas. However, the Education Directorate has worked tirelessly to support students and families, both at home and abroad, and I want today to acknowledge their efforts. I have little doubt they will translate into some excellent outcomes and exciting future career opportunities.
On to safety and security, the Governor mentioned the work of the police, the fire service and the FIDF, and also the prison service.
It has also been a busy year for the prison service, with the highest inmate population ever seen, and some very challenging individuals requiring detention at Her Majesty's pleasure. To support this volume of work, temporary funding was also secured for an additional prison officer, to ensure that staffing levels remain safe and resilient.
Whilst the Customs and Immigration Department may not have had as many tourists coming through the islands, they've certainly had their challenges with regards to changing travel requirements and documents over the past year. This year has also seen the highest number of applications for PRP and status, where more people have chosen to make the Falklands their permanent home. The Governor concluded his speech by looking forward to the future, and especially this coming year with the 40th anniversary of the 1982 conflict.
In 2022, we will mark the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War. Preparations for this landmark occasion are already taking shape under the strapline "Looking Forward at 40. In celebrating our liberation, we will reflect on the sacrifices made by those who fought for our freedom, but also on the progress that has been made since, and that freedom restored. While the past year has certainly been an unprecedented one, I think the way in which the nation has acquitted itself during the most testing of times is a tribute to the fundamental spirit of the Falkland Islands.
With His Excellency the Governor having finished his speech and the MLAs having given their vote of thanks, the Legislative Assembly then continued with their business, which included the papers laid on the table. Secondary legislation regarding the infectious diseases control and regulations was noted. MLA Leona Roberts, who holds the portfolio for emergency services, had this to say.
I think it is important to speak to these regulations, as they do give the government quite significant powers, which potentially impinge upon constitutional rights and freedom of movement and all those things that we've wrestled with over the last year. What they do, as my honourable colleague has set out, is provide for a short, sharp circuit breaker approach, locking down potentially for 21 days if the need arises. It sets out how we can control movement to and from specific geographical areas, and how and when people can be instructed to stay at home and for what reasons they can leave. So they are very significant powers, and I think that they are entirely justified in what is an ongoing global crisis, and it's right that we are prepared as we can be. I think these are very sensible, appropriate and proportionate measures, and I truly hope that we never ever have to use them, but I think it is right that we have them lined up and ready to go should the need arise.
Moving on to the budget itself, the Financial Secretary was invited to report on the proceedings of the Select Committee on the estimates. The Financial Secretary said that for the financial year 2020-2021, there was a forecast operating budget surplus of £11.1 million compared to an original budget surplus of £9.9 million.
Overall revenue for Falkland Islands Government for this current financial year is now forecast at approximately £97 million. Of this forecast revenue for 2020-21, the bulk is driven by over £30 million of corporation and personal tax, nearly £30 million relating to fishing licence fees, and £11 million of investment income. The Falkland Islands Government maintains a healthy consolidated fund balance, which more than covers the entirety of our funding requirements for financial year 2021-22. It is the consolidated fund that represents the unrestricted funds belonging to the Falkland Islands Government that are not already allocated to other purposes. I'm very confident that we will continue to maintain and deliver a healthy position.
The Financial Secretary also confirmed that the unspent cash from the previous year's public diplomacy and PR budgets will be used to fund celebrations for the 40th anniversary of the liberation. A paper on this will be put to Exco. The Financial Secretary also confirmed the protected reserve.
Risks do of course exist of an unforeseen reduction in one or more of the main revenue streams enjoyed by the Falkland Islands Government. So a protected reserve of 2.5 times departmental operating costs has been maintained, and this was once again renewed as a budget principle during the current financial year. With a strong economy, as we've already discussed this morning, and the contribution made in particular by the fishing industry, along with farming, construction and in normal years tourism, the finances of the government remain stable.
Moving on to the appropriation bill, which this year is £102.9 million. This is the bill to authorise the movement of funds from the Consolidated Fund in readiness for the next financial year. The draft estimates for the coming financial year propose a budget operation expenditure and pension fund transfers totalling £78.3 million. The total income budgeted for the coming financial year is £92.2 million, which means that the budgeted revenue more than pays for the expenditure.
This means that there's a budgeted surplus in the operating budget. This will be used for investment in capital projects and maintaining a reasonable level of reserves. Delivery of such surpluses will always remain critical to the future aspirations included in the island's plan for major capital investments.
So the amount that FIG plans to spend in the financial year 2021 to 2022 can be broken down as follows: £69.6 million on departmental operating expenditure, £6.1 million on island plan investments, £0.3 million on oil development, £2.3 million on transfers to pension funds, and £25.9 million on the transfer to the Capital Equalisation Fund. The Financial Secretary said that there were some contract increases to pay, a number of new posts to support delivery frontline services, and other minor amendments to operational requirements.
I must make it clear at this point that given the absence of inflationary pressures in the economy in our reference quarters ending both September and December of 2020, no cost of living increase is proposed in salaries for employees of government. The delivery of effective public services has never been more vital to the security, development, educational, societal cohesion and health of the Falkland Islands.
The island's plan part of the budget, the £6.1 million allocated, goes to assist non-governmental organisations, social payments and funding of other programmes.
In terms of the main subvention bodies, the following allocations were agreed. £500,000 as a contribution to the Tourist Board, £500,000 as an operating subsidy to Falkland Islands Meat Company, £272,000 to support Falklands Radio and Media, up to £750,000 to be made available to the Falkland Islands Development Corporation, £210,000 to Falklands Conservation, and £100,000 to SARI as they continue to develop their longer-term plans.
Unfortunately, the Museum and National Trust is unlikely to receive a payment from government based on passenger levy due to the absence of tourists. So a dialogue between FIG and the museum continues as to how long-term plans can be supported, and in the short term they'll be funded by their existing reserves and a subvention of £150,000. With regards to the revenue sources for the government, corporation tax and income tax rates will remain the same, and there'll be no inflationary increases in fees and charges for most items.
Of particular note, however, in this year's budget are: electricity prices will continue to be reviewed each quarter, but this budget assumes they will rise to 23p per unit with effect from the 1st of July 2021. This is the level that unit prices were at immediately prior to the reduction implemented during the first stages of the COVID pandemic, when they were reduced from 23p to 18p per unit.
Other rises include a £25 increase in the annual service charge and an additional £15 per month in furniture hire for government housing. Welfare and social benefits and pensions all remain the same. However, the winter fuel allowance has increased, or will increase, to £700 per qualifying household, and minimum wage will increase from £7.13 an hour to £7.26 an hour from January 22. On the subject of wage increases, it was MLA Mark Pollard who stood up to say that inflation had been affected largely by the price in fuel globally going up, and urged the next Assembly to look at increasing wages.
I do feel that, again, another warning perhaps for the incoming Assembly, that a lot of the inflation has been based around falling fuel prices and heavily influenced by that. I think we're seeing fuel prices going back up. So I think there is a risk of a double increase next year, and I would just urge the incoming Assembly to increase wages accordingly as well if inflation does do that, but we have no idea what it will do.
MLA Roberts commented that the budget was a prudent approach and stressed that this wasn't austerity.
A couple of comments, actually, some have already been touched on. I think the word of the budget has been prudence. We won't talk about the envelope of legend, but I think we've got there through a lot of work as was set out. But I do agree that, despite that prudent approach, with my honourable colleague Mark Pollard's comments, that, this isn't austerity. We are in a good, strong position. It is just about being careful, prudent, sensible going forwards.
The full capital programme for the coming financial year is set at £53.7 million. MLA Mark Pollard stressed how the items on the capital programme were essential.
But I just wanted to say with the capital programme, there are very few nice to haves on the capital programme. I consider almost every item on there to be essential infrastructure. So I think, whilst it may seem at odds that we're calling for prudence in the operational budget and we're spending so much money in the capital budget, I think it's with good reason we have to address these infrastructure issues.
The Financial Secretary had already confirmed that there wouldn't be any increase in fees apart from a few. The banking licence fee, for instance, now increases to £13,000. Some court fees are reduced and, of course, the minimum wage increases. Alcohol and tobacco will increase in price. Duty on alcohol will increase by 3% and duty on tobacco will increase by 5%. MLA Mark Pollard was particularly vocal on the subject of increasing the duty on these items, and it was MLA Dr Barry Ellsby who gave him the scientific background.
I understand the view of putting alcohol up by 3% and cigarettes up by 5% every year. I wonder at what point we're just hitting the poorly paid members of society in the pocket unnecessarily. I think if people were going to give up smoking, they probably would have done when a pack of cigarettes reached sort of £10 a packet. It's I would like us to do a bit more work into actually, is this discouraging people from undertaking these activities in the first place, rather than just hitting them in the pocket constantly, more and more every single year, especially in a zero inflation and zero pay growth budget. I wonder if 3 and 5% are a bit much, but perhaps I'm one way on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There's no one easy answer to stopping smoking, and many people found different ways, be that by being banned from smoking in the workplace, being banned from smoking on public transport and flights, be that with education, be that with counselling, be that with drugs, and in there also is the cost. And I think it will help to deter younger non-smokers from taking that first step onto what could be a very long, addictive and life-threatening course. And recently the Scottish Government have published some results of their fixed unit price of alcohol, the minimum unit price, and that's shown a reduction in problem drinkers of between 8 and 10%. And that's quite significant, and I think other countries and other members of the UK will also be looking at introducing such a thing. Not suggesting we do it here, but there is evidence it works.
I accept there is evidence in other places that putting the price up works. Of course, if you put it up to an unaffordable price, of course it will work. That's fairly common sense. But my point is, is it working in the Falkland Islands as a policy? Are we just putting it up and up, and people addicted to smoking, people addicted to alcohol, will carry on purchasing the products regardless of how much you put it up? Or is the future actually education and programs to support people through these things rather than just arbitrarily upping the price constantly? That's my point. Thank you.
The sitting of the Legislative Assembly concluded at just around 12:30, a mammoth 3.5-hour session. MLA Roger Edwards gave a note of caution to the next Assembly.
As of today, the Falkland Island Government establishment is 743. Over the last few months, we have increased that by 21, which takes the figure up to 764. That's as of the 1st of July. When this assembly was elected, we had 634 people working in government, so we've seen an increase in 130 in the numbers. And how does this affect the operating budget? Well, if you look at the budget book, our salaries, wages and staffing costs when we came into being was 26 million. The last recorded figures in the budget book and budgeted for 2021 had risen to over 33 million pounds, an increase of over 6.3 million. That increase in the expenditure will continue year on year on year. So that puts the operating budget up 34 million plus going forward. But I would like to highlight that caution. We must look after, if we're going to maintain savings of 2.5 times the operating budget, we need to keep that operating budget under close control. And I feel at the moment that we're not. Because times are good, it's so easy to employ a few extra people here, a few extra people there, and it runs away with it. And I just give it as a note of caution and encourage the people who are standing for election in November to look carefully at those figures and to see where we are going.